Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge, and welcome to Eldridge and Company. I didn't realize that the United States is one of just 28 worldwide countries worldwide that doesn't guarantee in its constitution equality between men and women. I can't imagine that until I read this new book, We the Women, the Unstoppable Mothers of the Equal Rights Amendment. The author, Phyllis Suk, is a professor of sociology and political science at the CUNY Graduate Center. She's also the dean of graduate students in what, Julie? Before I introduce you, correct me, please.
I'm the dean for master's programs at the Graduate Center.
I know how she does everything. And I know that she's considered to be a scholar, well, she is a scholar of constitutions and especially of women's rights. So anyway, in this book, we learn why we don't have it. It's a long, torturous journey, and she describes it very well. So do you want to start, or should I start it? You start 100 years ago, really, with the Suffrage Amendment. Right after the women got the Suffrage Amendment, they then started to amend the Constitution, right?
Absolutely. So the Suffrage Amendment, the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution, was added to the Constitution 100 years ago yesterday, August 26, 1920. And once the Suffrage Amendment was added to the Constitution, many of the suffragists thought that was only the beginning for women's rights, even though it was also the end of a long, tortured battle. And at the end of that long, tortured battle for the vote, women wanted to use the vote to get everything else that they needed in order to be equal in society. And that included getting rid of laws that discriminated against women. That's what the Equal Rights Amendment was proposed to do in 1923. Although really, some of the suffragists who were interested in the issue began to work on it right away as soon as they got the 19th Amendment passed. I mean, one of the things that I found so fascinating about this story is that even though there are certain women like Alice Paul who often gets credit for as though she single-handedly introduced the amendment. Of course, it wasn't Alice Paul acting alone. There were many women who were part of the National Women's Party who supported the Equal Rights Amendment and worked on it, including Crystal Eastman in the early 1920s. But that said, the National Women's Party was the only women's group, the only suffragist group that really supported the ERA when it was first introduced. Many women's groups, including a group that formed of former suffragists, the National League of Women Voters and the National Consumers League, which involved Florence Kelley, who worked to protect the rights of women working in industry. Many of them were a little bit skeptical about putting an Equal Rights Amendment into the US Constitution right at that precise moment, largely because they were worried about what the judiciary, which at that point was mostly men, entirely men actually, they were worried about what the judiciary would do with the amendment and whether or not the judiciary would interpret it in a manner that would be beneficial to all women, and particularly women working in industry.
It was so interesting to realize the power that men had and the fear they had of women having any power. I mean, I'm jumping ahead, when the Equal Rights Amendment was introduced in the Congress, the attempt to even get a hearing took how many years?
Well, there were hearings in 1925. It was introduced in 1923, and there were hearings in a subcommittee and in subcommittees of the House Judiciary and Senate Judiciary Committees throughout the 20s and the 1930s. But it actually did not get debated on the floor of either house until much later. So it's not until 1950 that you get the Senate voting by 2/3 majority to adopt the amendment, and then again in 1953. But even when the Senate voted it out, the House of Representatives did not follow. And the House of Representatives did not follow because the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, Emanuel Seller, really did not support the amendment and did not want it reported out and considered by the entire body of the House of Representatives.
And he was considered a mainstream Democrat, and in those days, the Democrats were always considered the more liberal Democrats in the Roosevelt FDR image. I mean, it was so interesting. But he's the one that Liz Holtzman finally defeated.
Absolutely.
Placed him.
So Yeah, absolutely. What's really interesting is that there's actually a lot of support for the ERA in the early 1970s. But if you look at the men who opposed it, they come from both political parties. There weren't that many who opposed it, but they came from both political parties. Emanuel Seller was a Democrat. Sam Ervin from North Carolina was also a Democrat.
Right.
But there were also Republicans who supported it, Republicans who were against it. So it was very mixed in that regard. Now, I would say for someone like Emanuel Seller, who opposed it for so long, part of the reason he opposed it was that he was sympathetic to, and in fact, he was in the House for so long. He was actually there in 1923 when the amendment was first introduced. And so part of his opposition came from his sympathy to labor rights. That is, those who really wanted minimum wage and maximum hours legislation that the Supreme Court had been striking down in the early part of the 20th century, they were skeptical of the ERA because they were worried that it would be used by the judiciary as an excuse to strike down labor protections, particularly labor protections that were for women only in the early part of the 20th century. And I think it was kind of a holdover of that kind of thinking that Emanuel Seller kept opposing the ERA even long after the Supreme Court was already upholding labor protections for everyone.
Did the unions dominated by men, did they oppose it?
So I think it really mixed. It was really mixed by the time that it was actually adopted in the 1970s. But there are certainly women who are active in the labor movement and from the unions who even as late as 1970, like Myra Wolfgang, testified against the ERA in 1970 because she was concerned that it would actually end certain labor protections for women that benefited women who are trying to juggle motherhood with working.
So interesting. It took what kind of a vote? Is it three quarters of the Senate and the House, or 2/3
So,
to vote for it?
So Article 5 of the US Constitution sets up the rules by which we ratify the US Constitution, by which we adopt amendments. And the Article 5 actually requires that Congress, that both houses of Congress adopt by 2/3 majority and 3/4 of the states ratify. That is, the state legislatures have to ratify it. And of course, that's a very high bar. It's extremely difficult to get that level of consensus, and that's what's required to amend the Constitution under Article 5.
Right, so which were the first states to approve it?
So I believe the first state was Hawaii. In fact, Hawaii actually might have voted to approve it even before they were allowed to, because the time difference got people very confused. And it's not a coincidence that Hawaii was the first state to ratify the ERA, because Hawaii was the state of Patsy Takemoto Mink, who was a Japanese American woman elected to Congress in 1964, the first woman of color ever elected to Congress, actually. And she was a fierce proponent of the ERA on the floor in debates about the ERA. And while she was advocating for the ERA, she had advocated for other pieces of very important legislation that was to the benefit of working women and working mothers in particular.
So it took a long time, and even New York State didn't pass it. I remember that battle very well.
So actually, New York State ratified the federal ERA in the 1970s, but the battle in New York State was about the state ERA, because every state constitution has, every state has its own constitution. And in the 1970s, some of the states adopted equal rights amendments for their state constitutions, especially when the women's liberation movement brought this question of adding such a provision to the Constitution to the forefront of public debate. But in New York State, there was a contentious fight about the proposal of adding an ERA to the New York State Constitution. And to this day, the New York State Constitution does not guarantee non-discrimination on grounds of sex, although it is something that the legislature has been working on the last few years.
And I'm sure now that we have slightly changed legislation that is, I think, more apt to pass it. Maybe we'll see it happen. So tell me now, it expired without getting the necessary number of states' ratification. So it was considered dead. The problem was there was a time limit. Explain that, which plays a very important part in this whole thing.
So when Congress adopted it, it asked the states to ratify it within 7 years. There was a resolution proposing the amendment. The amendment was written a particular way, but in the resolution sending it out to the states, it said that the amendment would be valid when ratified within 7 years by 3/4 of the states. And that provision was actually something that was used in a lot of constitutional amendments that were proposed after the Prohibition Amendment in the early part of the 20th century. So it became something that was just a normal part of the constitutional amendment process. But what happened was that only 35 states ratified it by the time you got to 1977. And so with the clock ticking, 1979 would mark 7 years since the time that Congress adopted it. Congress decided to actually extend the deadline once. So they took a vote in 1978 to extend the deadline to 1982. And once they did that, they were hopeful that more states would ratify it, but 1982 came and went and no additional states ratified it at the time. And so people assumed that it was dead for a while until 2017 when Nevada ratified the Equal Rights Amendment, and then Illinois followed in 2018 and Virginia followed in 2020. So then we got up to the magic number, 38 states. And after Virginia ratified it in January of this year, the House of Representatives in Congress took the vote to extend the deadline again. And instead of just extending it to another date, they actually took the vote to lift the deadline altogether. That is, Congress said that they would recognize the ERA as validly ratified whenever 3/4 of the states ratified it, which would be January 2020 of this year. But the problem is that the Senate has not taken similar action. And so the House's vote, even though historic and important, does not remove the deadline unless the Senate also takes action.
So it's so interesting because, of course, it's so connected to politics, right?
Of course, yes.
And I would think that the incoming Senate, well, the House won't have to pass it again, right?
Well, they will if they're in a new session, because generally legislation, if the Senate doesn't act on it in the same session, it dies, it goes to the legislative graveyard. And that'll also be true of legislation removing the deadline. So the House would have to pass it again. And I think the composition of the House would have to stay roughly the same in order for the House to pass it again next session if the Senate doesn't act this year.
And the Senate would have to change its composition. It's very important.
I believe so. Right now there are 48 co-sponsors in the Senate. It's possible that there are additional senators who will sign on as co-sponsors. But one of the issues is not only that there aren't enough co-sponsors. Even if there was more support, Mitch McConnell says he's personally not a supporter of the ERA. So even if there is more support in the Senate, it's not really clear that it would go to the floor and get a full hearing by the entire Senate.
So do you think, I mean, now it's just plain politics, right? Mm-hmm. And you're teaching political science. Well, I mean, we have this strength and movement of women from the Women's March, from all the Me Too business. Has it been a campaign issue? I haven't heard that in different states it's been a campaign issue.
So at the federal level, it has not really been made into a campaign issue, although one of the most remarkable things about Virginia's ratification this year in January 2020 was the way in which many people, including women and women of color, made it into a campaign issue in the elections in 2019 for the Virginia legislature. Because what happened in Virginia is that really since the 70s, there were supporters of the ERA that were trying to get the ERA ratified throughout the 1970s and then also in recent years. And often it would just get stuck in committee. A few opponents in the committee, like as many as 4 people, could hold it up and prevent it from getting a full debate by the entire House of Delegates in Virginia. And that actually happened in early 2019. In early 2019, in the Virginia legislature, the Senate actually passed it by a very healthy majority, and it even had bipartisan co-patrons. There was a Republican man who actually sponsored the ERA bill in the Virginia Senate, But in the Virginia House of Delegates, it did not get out of committee. There are a few people who really held it up, and it did not get out of committee. And I think people knew, though, that Virginia was changing and that large numbers of voters in Virginia actually did support the ERA. So there were many people who ran for the House of Delegates who made it a campaign issue in 2019. And then true to their promise, well, they flipped the legislature, first of all, in November 2019, and true to their promise in January 2020, one of the first things they did when the Virginia General Assembly opened for its session this year was to ratify the ERA.
The Democrats had the majority. I know it's a bipartisan issue. I mean, but it tends more to be a Republican anti-issue, doesn't it? I mean,
today, yes, it is significant that there are key Republicans who support the ERA in Congress. Lisa Murkowski from Alaska has been a very important person in the Senate. She is one of the sponsors of the bill in the Senate. But yes, it is true that it has become much more partisan than it was in the 1970s.
When abortion first became legal in 1970 in New York, the deciding vote was somebody who voted against it, but then his son wrote to him and it became a personal challenge, and he voted for it and made it pass. And that's happened other places too. Somebody would hear from their mother or something and say, right, if you don't do this, what are you, it's just not right. Anyway, why people say we don't need the ERA. And there are several reasons given. It's supposedly very good for working mothers, certainly. And explain why. Why is it considered more beneficial for women of color than it is generally? Are there?
Well, no, I would not say that. So I think that you mentioned first that there are people who say we don't need it. Mm-hmm. And I think that is an important argument, because the reason people don't think that we need it is that we have other laws that prohibit discrimination against women. And also, it's been 50 years, almost 50 years since the time that Congress actually adopted the ERA, and time did not stand still. Law did not stand still from 1972 until now. That is, the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution, which guarantees equal protection. In 1970, the Supreme Court had never interpreted that to prohibit sex discrimination, but the Supreme Court changed its views. And throughout the 1970s, largely because of the amazing lawyering by now Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Supreme Court began to recognize sex discrimination as a problem under the Constitution we already have. That is the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. And so some people say because of all the progress that women made, they just don't need the ERA anymore. And I disagree with that point, because I think it's because of the political momentum for the ERA in the 1970s that the Supreme Court changed its mind on how to interpret the 14th Amendment. So the ERA has already changed the Constitution. Women have already changed the Constitution. And now, by adding the ERA, now that we've got the 38th ratification, by adding the ERA to the Constitution, it would legitimize and make official what women have worked hard to get for so long.
Would it make childcare a necessity? I mean, legal? I mean, we'd have to have childcare available for working women?
Well, one thing that we have to understand is that constitutional rights don't speak in very specific policy terms. Constitutional rights in the United States are extremely general, and the Equal Rights Amendment is no different. The Equal Rights Amendment really just says equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. So it doesn't say anything specific about childcare. And like the right to vote, it's only a beginning. Lawmakers and lawyers have to do the heavy lifting once you have the ERA in place. But I will say that as a historical matter, some of the women who were fierce proponents of the ERA, at the same time they were working on the ERA, they were working on childcare legislation, the Comprehensive Child Development Act, Patsy Mink, Shirley Chisholm, women of color who really cared about Women of color who are working and working mothers. There are a large portion of women of color who are actually working mothers, and a lot of women of color historically worked because they had to. And so because of these experiences, Shirley Chisholm and Patsy Mink were very interested in public policy around childcare. Now, this is not to say that the ERA absolutely requires Congress to adopt childcare legislation. What the ERA does is it legitimizes a political movement that says women are fully equal citizens to men. And once we have that principle firmly enshrined in our Constitution, I think people need to start behaving, and lawmakers will start behaving as though that's true. And that means not only getting rid of laws that disadvantage women or discriminate against them, it also means generating new public policy and having a public policy making enterprise in our legislatures that always thinks about what they need to do, what lawmakers need to do to ensure that women as a lived reality are fully equal citizens.
So people will be, you think will find challenges and all kinds of court, decisions that will follow from this? I don't know. It's so interesting because I mean, women who are working, of course, with children can't really equate their experiences with the men, right? So obvious. So that would be legislation, and that would have to happen statewide or nationally?
Well, it could happen either way. When the ERA was actually making its way through Congress, in fact, 50 years ago, yesterday, August 26, 1970, the biggest women's march of the 20th century happened across the country. And in fact, just yesterday, I was in Bryant Park to talk about the fact that it was the 50th anniversary of the Women's Strike for Equality. And one of the most important demands of the Women's Strike for Equality, this was a commemoration of women's right to vote. They drew attention to childcare because the idea was that you can have laws that say that women are equal. You could have laws that say you can't discriminate against women. But if you don't provide support for childcare, the lived reality of women is that they won't be able to take advantage of the equal opportunities that exist on paper unless society comes up with a way of taking care of and raising its children that's not solely dependent on the free, undercompensated or uncompensated work of mothers in the home. And this was a very important insight in the context of the ERA because there were people out there throughout the 1970s, including most famously Phyllis Schlafly, who claimed that if women got equality, it would destroy the American family. But of course, the reality was, since World War I and World War II, that women were already working. And if women were already working and needed to do so in order to achieve economic independence and some level of economic security, it meant that we had to figure out a way as a society to bear and raise children in a manner that was fully respectful of women's equal status as participants in the economy and in politics.
Of course, that was always the riddle or the question about Phyllis Schlafly, that she was against equal rights, and that, and there she was, an independent woman who was certainly not going to listen to any male telling her not to do anything. I just want everybody to know that you're a former professor of law, that you're a scholar of constitutions and equality. You've worked with other countries on their constitutions. That's a question.
So a lot of my research and leading up to some of my more recent research about the ERA was on gender equality provisions in constitutions around the world, particularly in Europe. So I was interested in the moments at which constitutions began to explicitly say equal rights between women and men in their constitutions. So I've done some work in my scholarly writings on the German Constitution. At Weimar in 1919, the constitution that was adopted explicitly guaranteed equality of rights between women and men. And then that, of course, the Weimar Constitution had many problems and therefore did not survive. But actually many of the rights provisions that were in the Weimar Constitution and this provision about equal rights between women and men made its way into the West German basic law that was adopted after World War II. And that's the same basic law, the Constitution of Germany, that reigns in Germany today. And then after World War II, many other constitutions that were written after war carried over this commitment to equal rights between women and men. And it came not only from the inspiration of the Weimar Constitution earlier, but also from many international norms that emerged after World War II. The UN Charter explicitly, the UN Charter explicitly made reference to equal rights between women and men.
Did Eleanor Roosevelt lead that march, that movement, partly? I think she was very active, wasn't she?
Well, she was with regard to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Eleanor Roosevelt actually, with regard to the ERA, her sympathies early on were actually with the social feminists who were concerned that an ERA in the United States might actually lead to the disadvantage of working women. So she didn't necessarily support the ERA initially. Yeah. And this is actually something very interesting and important about the discourse on the ERA in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s, that many of the women, like Florence Kelley, for example, who opposed the ERA in the United States, admired the constitutional guarantees of equal rights between women and men in other countries, because in other countries, they did not have judiciaries, judges with so much power that they could actually strike down statutes that were passed by legislatures to help protect workers and working women. And so because you have a completely different institutional setup and a different culture, both politically and legally in other countries, the way in which a guarantee in the Constitution about equal rights plays out is going to differ significantly in other countries as compared to the United States.
We've come to the end of this program. I certainly hope people will read your book. It's fun to read. It's interesting to read.
Well, thank you so much, Ronnie. I appreciate that.
It's not a scholarly, it is scholarly, but it's really fun, and you should really read it. I thank you so much, Julie Suk, and I don't know how you handle everything, but I admire it greatly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ronnie. It's been a pleasure talking with you.